The first snowfall of December blanketed our small town in pristine white, and as I walked home from the grocery store, the scent of pine trees filled the air. Christmas was days away, and every window glowed with warm lights or featured a decorated tree, promising comfort and joy. Yet, as I approached our house, those feelings eluded me. Mom was in the kitchen when I entered, her hands busy kneading dough for cookies. She didn't look up immediately, but the familiarity of her presence wrapped around me like a soft blanket. "You're late," she said, her voice even but tinged with that maternal edge that always made me feel simultaneously cared for and guilty. "I stopped by the bookstore," I replied, setting the bags on the counter. "Thought I'd grab something to read while I'm home." Her hands paused briefly, and she glanced at me, her eyes softening. "You and your books. What did you find this time? A novel about, I don't know, finding yourself, I guess." I shrugged, not wanting to delve too deep into a conversation about it. "Seemed fitting." She tilted her head, her smile faint but genuine. The kind that always seemed to say, "I know more than you're telling me. Good choice." We spent the next hour decorating cookies in comfortable silence. It was something we always did together when I was younger, a tradition that had faded during my teenage years. Now, as a college student home for the holidays, it felt strange to slip back into the rhythm of these small rituals. "Do you remember the time you dropped an entire tray of cookies when you were 8? She asked suddenly, her voice filled with laughter. "I don't think I ever heard the end of it," I replied, grinning despite myself. "You scolded me for an hour, only because you tried to blame the dog," she teased, nudging my shoulder. Her touch lingered a moment longer than expected, and when our eyes met, the air shifted. It was subtle, just a flicker of something that felt both familiar and unsettling. I looked away first, focusing on the sprinkles I was scattering over a snowman-shaped cookie. "Do you ever miss those days?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "When everything felt simpler?" Her smile faltered, and she leaned against the counter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes. But life moves on, doesn't it?" The weight of her words settled in the room, and I found myself wanting to ask more, to delve into the unspoken thoughts that seemed to hang between us. But I didn't. Instead, I busied myself with arranging the cookies on a plate, pretending not to notice the way she watched me. Later that evening, we sat by the fireplace, the room dimly lit by the glow of the Christmas tree. She handed me a mug of hot chocolate, her fingers brushing mine. It was such a small thing, yet it sent a ripple through me, a sensation I couldn't name and wasn't sure I wanted to. "You've grown up so much," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the fire. "Sometimes I look at you and wonder where the years went." I laughed awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. "Well, I am 21 now. Time flies." She turned to me then, her expression unreadable. "It does. But some things, they stay the same." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with a meaning I couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge. We sat in silence after that, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the faint hum of Christmas carols playing on the radio. As the evening wore on, I excused myself, retreating to my old bedroom. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, the faint scent of pine from the tree downstairs filling the air. My mind replayed the moments of the day, the fleeting looks and unspoken words that seemed to carry more weight than they should. Christmas was supposed to be a time of joy and togetherness, yet I felt a knot of unease in my chest. Something between us had shifted, something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to face. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in quiet stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath us had become unsteady, threatening to crack open and reveal truths we weren't prepared to confront. Tomorrow, perhaps, things would feel normal again. Or perhaps they wouldn't. The days leading up to Christmas had always felt magical when I was younger, filled with the smell of fresh-baked cookies, the glow of twinkling lights, and the promise of gifts waiting under the tree. But this year was different. The decorations were all in place. The snow outside painted everything picturesque, and yet there was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite define. That evening, as I descended the stairs, the warmth of the fireplace hit me before I reached the living room. Mom was curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs and a book resting on her lap. She looked up when I entered, her smile soft but tired. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. I shrugged, moving to sit on the couch opposite her. "Just restless, I guess." She closed her book, setting it on the coffee table. "Must be the excitement of being back home," she teased lightly, though her tone held a trace of something more serious. I nodded, but my eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. She was beautiful in a way I had never quite noticed before. Her hair falling loose around her shoulders, her skin glowing softly in the light of the fire. It made me feel something that I couldn't name, a mix of admiration and guilt that tightened my chest. "Want some tea?" she offered, breaking the silence. "Sure," I said, needing something to ground me. She returned a few minutes later with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to me before settling back into her spot. We sipped in silence, the quiet between us both comforting and suffocating. "I miss having you home," she admitted suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The house feels so empty these days." I looked at her, caught off guard by the vulnerability in her tone. "I miss it too," I replied, though the words felt inadequate. Her gaze lingered on me, her eyes searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could give. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said after a pause. "How quickly everything changes. One moment you're a little boy chasing me around the kitchen, and now you're—" She stopped, her voice catching. "A man?" I finished for her, my tone more serious than I intended. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked away, focusing on her mug. "Yes," she said softly. "A man." The weight of her words hung between us, and for a moment, the room felt too small, the air too thick. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but my mind was blank. Instead, I reached out, placing a hand on hers. She didn't pull away. "You've always been there for me," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "I don't say it enough, but I'm grateful for everything you've done." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as she looked at me. "You don't have to thank me," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm your mother. That's what I'm here for." Something about the way she said it, so gentle, so full of emotion, made my chest tighten. Without thinking, I gave her hand a small squeeze. She squeezed back, her thumb brushing lightly over my skin. The touch was innocent, yet it sent a ripple through me that I couldn't ignore. "I should go to bed," she said abruptly, pulling her hand away and standing up. "It's getting late." "Yeah," I murmured, though neither of us moved. She hesitated, her eyes meeting mine one last time before she turned and walked upstairs. I stayed on the couch for a long while after she was gone, staring into the dying embers of the fire and trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. The next morning, I found her in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared breakfast. She looked up when I entered, her smile warm but cautious. "Good morning," she said, her voice cheerful but tinged with something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Morning," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. We moved around the kitchen in a familiar rhythm, the tension from the night before seemingly forgotten. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the memory of her hand in mine, the way her touch had lingered just a moment too long. That evening, as we decorated the Christmas tree, I caught myself stealing glances at her. She was laughing at some memory she had just shared, her eyes crinkling at the corners, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the fire. It was a look I'd seen 1,000 times before, yet tonight it felt different, more intimate, more captivating. "You're staring," she said suddenly, her tone playful but her expression unreadable. I looked away quickly, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. "Sorry," I muttered. "Just thinking." "About what?" she asked, setting down an ornament and turning to face me. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Just how much I've missed this," I said finally, keeping my tone light. "Being home, spending time with you." Her expression softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I've missed it too," she said, her voice low. "More than you know." The closeness between us felt electric, the air charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us dared to acknowledge. For a moment, The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of us, standing there in the glow of the Christmas lights. "Mom," I began, my voice faltering as her eyes met mine. "Don't," she said softly, shaking her head. "Just don't." But she didn't step back. Instead, she stayed where she was, her hand lingering on my shoulder, her gaze locked on mine. It felt as though we were standing on the edge of something vast and uncharted. A place we both knew we shouldn't go but couldn't seem to turn away from. "Maybe we should," she started. But her voice trailed off as her hand fell away. "Yeah," I said quickly, stepping back and breaking the spell. "We should." She nodded, turning back to the tree and picking up an ornament. But her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she were trying to steady herself. I watched her for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before I turned and walked out of the room. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she had looked at me, the way her touch had lingered just a moment too long. Something between us was shifting, something I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. Christmas was only a few days away, and I couldn't help but wonder what it would bring. Joy, connection, or perhaps a truth neither of us was ready to face. The house was wrapped in silence, the kind that feels louder than any noise. The snow outside reflected the soft glow of the moonlight, casting faint, silver patterns across my bedroom walls. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind was too crowded, spinning with thoughts I didn't want to name, feelings I couldn't quite suppress. The faint sound of a door opening caught my attention, followed by soft footsteps padding down the hallway. I held my breath, unsure of who or what I was expecting. The gentle knock at my door made my pulse quicken. "Come in," I said quietly, sitting up as the door creaked open. Mom stood there, illuminated by the faint glow of the hallway light. She was wearing a simple robe, cinched loosely at her waist, her hair slightly mussed as if she, too, had been tossing and turning. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, stepping into the room. "I kept thinking. Maybe you couldn't either." I shook my head, managing a small smile. "No, just too much on my mind, I guess." She closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment as if debating whether to stay. "Can I sit with you for a bit?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yeah," I said quickly, shifting over to make room for her on the bed. She crossed the room and sat beside me, the bed dipping slightly under her weight. For a moment we didn't speak. The silence between us wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, filled with all the things we didn't know how to say. "You've grown so much," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I look at you and wonder where the years went." I turned to face her, catching the way her eyes glistened in the dim light. "I could say the same about you," I replied, my tone softer than I intended. She laughed quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't feel like I've changed much," she said, though her gaze was searching, as if daring me to disagree. "You have," I said, "but not in a bad way." She looked down, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her robe. "It's strange, isn't it?" she murmured. "How much things can change without us even realizing it." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. The space between us felt charged, the air thick with something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but every word that came to mind felt too dangerous to speak. "Do you remember when you were little?" she began, her tone wistful. "And you'd crawl into my bed whenever you had a bad dream?" I smiled at the memory. "Yeah. You used to tell me stories to help me fall back asleep." Her lips curved into a soft smile. "You always loved the one about the boy who could talk to the stars. Because you made it sound like the stars were listening," I said, my voice quieter now. "Like they actually cared." "They did," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "At least, that's what I always believed." We fell into silence again, but this time it felt heavier, almost suffocating. I could feel the warmth of her beside me, the faint scent of her lavender lotion filling the air. It was so familiar, so comforting. Yet it made my heart race in a way I couldn't ignore. "Mom," I began, my voice catching in my throat. "There's something—" But she reached out then, her hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost hesitant, yet it sent a shiver through me that I couldn't suppress. "I know," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. "You don't have to say it." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence between us speaking louder than words ever could. Her hand lingered on mine, her fingers warm and steady. I wanted to pull away, to break the moment before it could spiral into something we couldn't undo. But I couldn't. "It's late," she said finally, her voice trembling slightly. "I should let you get some rest." She started to stand, but I reached out, my fingers curling gently around her wrist. "Don't go," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She hesitated, her eyes locking onto mine. "Are you sure?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Stay, please." She sank back down onto the bed, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hand rested on the blanket between us, so close that I could feel the faint heat of her skin. We didn't speak, but the air between us was thick with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings. I wasn't sure how long we sat there, the silence stretching on and on. But at some point, she leaned back against the pillows, her head resting just inches from mine. Her eyes fluttered shut, and her breathing began to slow, the tension in her shoulders easing. I turned my head to watch her, my chest tightening at the sight. She looked so peaceful, so vulnerable in that moment, and I felt a surge of something I couldn't name. It was overwhelming, this mix of affection and something deeper, something more complicated. "Good night," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, her eyes still closed. "Good night," she murmured. I lay there beside her, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, and for the first time in weeks, my mind felt quiet. Whatever this was, whatever we were, it didn't feel wrong in that moment. It just felt inevitable. As the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in silence, I let myself drift off, the warmth of her presence beside me lulling me into a dreamless sleep.